How have Albanian organised crime groups established themselves as dominant players in the European cocaine market? We've highlighted how a key part of their success has been establishing a new business model, one where they control the entire supply chain. In the previous episode, we covered how they established themselves in Latin America and secured their supply. In this episode, we'll examine how that supply makes its way into Europe and how Albanian organised crime groups operate in the market on this side of the Atlantic. So in the previous episode, we covered the point of origin of cocaine and some of the ports that Albanian groups are reported to have links to. And I will start this episode by covering the European ports that are reporting record seizures of cocaine year on year.
Albanian groups have dominated the cocaine trade in Europe after establishing relationships with cocaine traffickers and producers in Latin America and the Caribbean. They have infiltrated major freight transport companies to exploit transatlantic routes. Cocaine is trafficked either to North Europe, mainly the Netherlands and Belgium, or through the Mediterranean to Spain, France, Italy and Greece.
So according to official figures, Europe recorded record seizures of cocaine, increasing each year over 4 consecutive years up until 2020. Now, the official figures for 2021 haven't yet been made available, but it's likely that this would be another record year too. So according to official figures, there were 214 tons of cocaine seized in Europe in 2020. In 2021, at least 240 tons has reportedly been seized. 70% of the cocaine that's seized in Europe is seized in just 3 countries. That is Belgium, the Netherlands and Spain. And we've seen record seizures of cocaine in several European countries. These include Belgium and the Netherlands, Italy, France and Germany, Greece, Poland, Bulgaria and Turkey, as well as many others.
So ports that have really high volume, for example, the Port of Rotterdam, Port of Antwerp, and then have good infrastructure connectivity throughout Europe, they are becoming more and more popular just because drug traffickers can piggyback on this global network of really efficient supply chains. So one example of these efficient supply chains is, for example, bananas. Bananas are a really common product to stash cocaine in. One, because it's perishable good, so it has to go through customs quickly. And it's also produced in many Latin American countries, so it's a popular place to stash cocaine. But if you go to the shop and you buy bananas, they're usually really cheap. And if you think of all of the effort that's necessary to get bananas all the way from Ecuador, for example, to Europe, and you buy them for £1.50 or something, then you know how efficient the whole network must be. And so this is exactly what the drug traffickers hijack. And this is exactly what gives them the opportunity to traffic as much cocaine as they do.
So most of the cocaine that makes its way across Europe arrives on the continent in some of the largest container ports in the European Union. These are the Port of Antwerp in Belgium, the Port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, the ports of Valencia and Algeciras in Spain, as well as the Port of Hamburg in Germany, which recorded the largest single seizure of cocaine in Europe. However, other ports are also reporting increasingly frequent seizures of cocaine. These include the ports of Le Havre, Marseille and Dunkirk in France, the ports of Gioia Tauro and Livorno in Italy, the ports of Piraeus and Thessaloniki in Greece. And following significant Chinese investment, the port of Piraeus is now the 4th busiest port in Europe. And there's also an increasing cocaine pipeline directly to Albania, especially in the port of Durrës. Now, German authorities have attributed the recent increase in seizures in the port of Hamburg to the presence of Albanian-speaking and other Balkan organised crime groups in the area. As we mentioned earlier, Albanian-speaking groups have a significant presence and significant activities in the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam, alongside Moroccan and Dutch groups. We've also mentioned that the shipping of cocaine directly to Albania is an increasing phenomenon, as well as the shipping of cocaine to the ports in Greece, which are likely linked to the presence of Albanian organised crime groups, which have a significant control of the drug trade in the country.
In 2020, the total amount of cocaine seized in Greece increased by 87% compared to the previous year. This is the largest amount of cocaine seized in the country in the last 25 years. In 2021, the total amount of cocaine seized decreased. However, given the dramatic increase of the previous year, it was still a very significant amount. The vast majority of the cocaine seized was confirmed to have originated in Latin America, mainly Ecuador, Colombia, and Guatemala. Most of the cocaine was found in shipments in the ports of Piraeus, Thessaloniki, Patra, and Igoumenitsa, and it was usually hidden in shipments of bananas and coffee.
Greek ports, as well as other ports in the Balkans, such as Montenegro, are transit countries for cocaine that makes its way through the Western Balkans into Albania, and then from there is trafficked across the rest of Europe. Typically, cocaine shipped to Antwerp is then moved on to the Netherlands, and from there it is distributed across the continent to other buyers. For cocaine that's trafficked directly to Albania, organised crime groups use existing trafficking routes that have been developed through their marijuana smuggling or their human trafficking. So north and overland through other Balkan countries and onto Western Europe, south into Greece, or west over the Adriatic or Ionian Seas and into Italy. Now, there is some violence that's reported around these port cities in Europe, particularly places such as Antwerp and Rotterdam. Now, in the previous episode, we covered how violence in Ecuador has skyrocketed as its port cities are flooded with cocaine, and something similar is happening in Europe, although to nowhere near the same extent. We frequently see incidents such as bombings, shootings, kidnapping, and arson, among others, apparently linked to ongoing conflict between rival organised crime groups. However, while there have been reports of Albanians being killed among some of these incidents, Albanian groups largely avoid these clashes there. They prefer to work under the radar and in collaboration and cooperation with rival groups. Instead, the violence in places such as Antwerp and Rotterdam and Brussels are reportedly linked to conflict between Moroccan groups, while Albanians have reportedly profited from the instability that this conflict has caused by maintaining stability within their own operations. Now, how long this remains the case remains to be seen. Like we said, there have been instances of Albanians being caught up in the violence, although it's more likely that this is linked to disputes within Albanian groups themselves, as opposed to clashes with rival organised crime gangs. So how does cocaine make its way into these ports? Well, there are several methods for trafficking cocaine, but two of the most common are hiding cocaine within legitimate goods and the rip-on, rip-off method. So the first of these, the legitimate goods method, involves cocaine being hidden within shipments of ostensibly legitimate goods. For example, we mentioned bananas in the previous episode.
But besides bananas, you can put cocaine in anything. I've seen the weirdest thing. So fruit's obviously a good choice because it goes through customs quickly. But I've seen like coconuts, they put liquid cocaine inside coconuts, so it feels like a real coconut, but it's not. I've seen avocados where somehow the inside of the avocado, the pit, that's cocaine. But I don't know how they do it because they cut them open without, or they grow them with the cocaine inside. I don't know. But they have a way of doing it where the inside of avocado is cocaine. You can put it in liquids. You can put it in fabrics. So you can put it in clothing. You can put it in coal. I've seen in rocks and all kinds of things. And then, for example, if you put it into clothing and it comes to Europe, here in Europe you have these cocaine laundries, they're called, where those clothes are treated with a certain chemical and then the cocaine comes out again. In paper, you can put it really in anything. So drug traffickers will always try to be one step ahead of the imagination of the police.
Get in-depth insight on the activities of Albanian organised crime. Transnational organised crime is one of the biggest threats to security in Europe today, and the Albanian Mafia is one of the most significant organised crime groups on the continent. Using open source reporting and data from the Intelligence Fusion Threat Intelligence platform, We'll be releasing a comprehensive report on the state of Albanian organised crime groups and their impact on global security. Sign up now to receive the report as soon as it's released. Click the link in the description below. This can be done with the knowledge of a complicit company. This could involve criminal groups setting up front companies to ship these goods, or criminal groups could also purchase an existing business with a long history of clean shipments in order to avoid being flagged by customs. Now, the downside to this method is that certain companies may begin to be flagged by customs, may have suspicious patterns of activity, and the risk of interdiction will therefore increase. Additionally, certain goods that are commonly used to smuggle cocaine might be more likely to be searched by customs, therefore increasing the risk of your cocaine being seized. So the other method that is commonly favoured by cocaine traffickers is the rip-on, rip-off method. So the rip-on, rip-off method generally involves loading cocaine within the port itself. So traffickers will break open containers of legitimate goods. They will place bags of cocaine within the container itself and then use cloned custom seals to replace the one that they've just broken. Once within the destination port, another trafficker will then break in, remove the drugs, and then replace the seal with another clone seal to disguise the tampering. So while the first method generally involves the complicity of the company involved, the second one often takes place without the company whose goods are being used having any idea of what has happened. But what it does require is the complicity of workers within the port itself. Not only does it involve often recruiting port workers, it also requires customs officials.
Today I have 2 people who are in jail because they supported the criminal organizations. You help them say, this container, you don't put it on this part of the terminal. You put it on another place, you can earn 50,000 euros.
This is both to know where the container is within often very large ports, also often involves port workers themselves being the people who load and unload the drugs from shipping containers. Sometimes corrupt dock workers within EU ports will remove drugs from one container and place it in another that has already been cleared through customs. So both of these methods are commonly used by Albanian traffickers. For example, Arbe Cekai, an Albanian trafficker who was arrested in 2018 and had allegedly been trafficking cocaine from South America directly to Albania in shipments of bananas dating back until 2009. And another example is Nezdet Vokshi, who is a Dutch Albanian trafficker wanted in the Netherlands, who was arrested first in Peru and then again in Ecuador in 2022, who was a registered independent fruit trader with businesses in both South America and Barcelona in Spain. Meanwhile, Albanians in Rotterdam have been given the nickname wheatilers, which means unloaders, because of their capability at the rip-on, rip-off method and removing cocaine from shipments before they leave the port. Now, another method which is featured in reporting is cocaine being hidden within goods themselves. As part of this method, cocaine is melted within actual products, for example, in clothing, plastic, wood, or even food products. So by concealing cocaine in this way, it deceives the sense of smell of police dogs, it's harder to detect on scanners, and passes visual checks by customs officials as well. Now, once the goods have passed through customs and reached their destination, they are taken to a laundry or an extraction laboratory. Here, traffickers use a collection of different chemicals to extract the cocaine from the product itself. Now, the first such laboratory discovered in Belgium was in a town called Arendonk in 2021. And since then, others have been uncovered in Liège, Brussels, and Antwerp. Now, Colombian nationals have been arrested at these laboratories, and there are suggestions that as part of the arrangement of the shipment of cocaine, Colombian groups are sending chemists over to train European criminals on how to extract the cocaine. And this reportedly includes Albanian criminals too. So, for example, in November 2022, a laboratory was uncovered in the town of Fiere Now, in this case, cocaine was hidden among a shipment of chemical fertilizer at a property owned by the former mayor of Fracula municipality, a man by the name of Victor Cervenacu. So as we've mentioned, Albanian groups have demonstrated a capacity and a willingness to cooperate with rival groups, as well as developing their existing close relationships that they've built up over the years with other European organised crime groups, such as the 'Ndrangheta and other Italian mafia groups. So Albanians continue to work closely with all Italian mafia groups. And there are even examples of Albanian criminals attending talks between high-level Italian capos. So one example is the Pax Mafiosa talks, which took place in Ostia, a neighbourhood in Rome. Now, alongside the heads of local mafia groups was a man by the name of Dorian Petoku, who is a lieutenant for an Albanian organised crime group that operates within Rome. As we've also mentioned, there are reports of cooperation between Albanians and Moroccan, Dutch, and Belgian groups operating in Antwerp and Rotterdam. This is generally along the logistics, the distribution of cocaine across Europe, and the removal of cocaine from the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam. There are reports of cooperation between Albanian criminals with Moroccan, Spanish and Colombian groups in Spain, while Albanians are reportedly the leading immigrant-dominated organised crime group in Germany, with drug trafficking their main activity. Now, above all else, as we've mentioned, they are seen as reliable suppliers and partners, as well as having the necessary fear factor to succeed within the drugs industry. Although they cooperate across ethnic lines and with groups across the rest of Western Europe, the core makeup of their organisation and their workforce remain primarily Albanian or Albanian speaking. And because of the size and the spread of the diaspora and the willingness of Albanian criminals to move and the ease with which they can move between countries, they have a constant access to workforce regardless of where they're located. So if a member of the organisation is arrested, or especially a low-level worker, they generally have a ready replacement lined up that can take over and the operation can continue pretty seamlessly. So that's the situation in mainland Europe, but it's the UK in particular where Albanians have proven themselves to be dominant actors in the cocaine trade. Now, Albanian organised crime groups are reportedly in control of the cocaine trade in pretty much every significant UK city, with the exception of Liverpool, where local groups have their own direct connection to Latin American cocaine and who defend their territory quite violently. Now, the UK market is potentially the most lucrative in Europe in terms of cocaine. Reportedly, it's worth over £5 billion every year. It has more users than anywhere else in Europe and the most demand, as well as having higher wholesale prices than elsewhere in Europe, even though it has come down in recent years since the Albanians took control. Reportedly, cocaine consumption in the UK was estimated to be around 117 tonnes in 2020. That's an increase of at least 290% since 2011. So, cocaine destined for the UK generally arrives on mainland Europe first. It's then distributed to locations such as France, Belgium, or the Netherlands, and then trafficked into the UK, often through roll-on, roll-off traffic, which is a key vulnerability exploited by Albanian gangs, via commercial or passenger ferries, or even on private shipping vessels such as yachts. However, there has been an increasing trend of shipments arriving in the UK directly from Latin America. In March 2022, for example, a shipment of more than 3.5 tonnes was seized in Southampton, hidden in a container of bananas that had originated in Colombia. In 2021, a seizure of more than 2 tonnes was recorded in the port of Portsmouth that had also travelled directly from Colombia. And while we mentioned yachts and other private vessels being a way of trafficking cocaine from mainland Europe into the UK, they're also reported to be trafficking cocaine directly from Latin America too. So within the UK itself, Albanian criminals are the main suppliers to nearly all local criminal gangs across the country. Now, this could be as part of the same Albanian network who are involved in the retail cocaine trade in the UK, or they could be acting as wholesale suppliers for British gangs themselves. A recent open source report quoted a source from the National Crime Agency stating that Albanians have a presence in all major UK cities and towns and operate supply networks stretching back to source and transit countries. So again, the Albanian groups operating in the UK or providing supply in the UK are connected all the way back through transit countries into source countries as well. As well as supplying powdered cocaine for sale on the retail market, they also supply cocaine to local trap houses where it is then turned into crack cocaine. Now, as a result of their success, cocaine has become incredibly easy for consumers to access, especially in places such as London, where Albanian gangs reportedly operate a 24/7 business model that can be delivered within minutes of an order being placed. So this flood of Albanian-controlled cocaine, as well as making cocaine a lot easier to access, increasing the purity and reducing the price within the country, has also potentially saturated the market within cities and major urban settlements. And this phenomenon has led to the development of the county lines network within the UK. So this involves moving drugs throughout the country into rural, coastal and inland provinces, typically across police and local authority boundaries. Now, the county line itself is generally referring to a phone line. So orders will be placed from, like I say, these more isolated and rural areas into gangs in the city, who will then exploit vulnerable people and children to run cocaine from cities across into these areas. Predominantly, county lines involves the sale of heroin and crack cocaine, but powdered cocaine is also increasingly being sold via this method too. And what we're seeing as a result of the county line networks is that importing areas are recording increased levels of violence associated with the drugs trade. And it also, as I've mentioned, involves the exploitation of young and vulnerable people. So a common method is something called cuckooing, where drug dealers will take over the house or the residence of a vulnerable person, often a drug user, and use it as a base of operations for selling and receiving drugs. We've also seen financially vulnerable people being exploited too. So, for example, a recent case involved a man called Rodney Addo, who lost his job as a security guard during the COVID-19 pandemic and instead began running a county line selling crack cocaine and heroin in Colchester. Now, what had happened in this case was that Addo had reportedly relapsed into a life of crime after getting into debt and was being controlled by so-called Albanian overlords. So while the availability and the purity of cocaine has risen and the price of cocaine has fallen, the level of violent crime in the country has also risen while the age of the perpetrators has fallen. Now, since 2014, there has been an increase of 25% in the number of adults being admitted to A&E for knife wounds. And there's been a 72% increase in the number of 16 to 18-year-olds. Now, as we've mentioned, at the same time as this has been happening, the price of cocaine has fallen year on year from 2012, which has coincided with Albanian groups taking control of the market. Now, meanwhile, so-called drug-related homicides have increased. 48% of homicides in the UK in 2020 were drug-related. So while Albanian criminals may not feature too frequently in open source reporting as the perpetrators of these violent crimes, and while correlation does not always imply causation, there's been a clear increase in violent crime in the UK alongside the establishment of county lines, which has coincided with the increase in the availability of cocaine as a result of Albanian gangs' involvement in the trade. And again, this has been reflected in reporting from agencies such as the NCA or National Crime Agency, which said in 2020, serious and organised crime continues to have more impact on UK citizens than any other national security threat. It affects all parts of the country, having a chronic and corrosive impact on the daily lives of individuals and communities, businesses, public services and national infrastructure. And another phenomenon worth commenting on at this point is the rise of ethnic Albanian second-generation immigrants who are involved in the drugs trade. Now, the most notorious of these is the Albanians, who are based in the Gascoigne estate in Barking in London. Now, they post brash music videos, write drill songs boasting about their exploits in the drugs trade, and have made headlines, as you might expect, among the UK press. Now, what's interesting about this is it would appear to be in direct contradiction of the general modus operandi of Albanian organised crime groups involved in the drugs trade, who, as we've established, prefer to maintain a low profile and avoid the attention of law enforcement and even rival groups. But it is something we've seen in Albanian enterprises elsewhere. For example, we mentioned the use of TikTok as a form of advertising for their human trafficking networks. And it's likely that many of these music videos are intended as a form of advertising and marketing that is having an effect on attracting migrants from Albania to see the UK as a way to make money, as the wealthy lifestyle is flaunted by the Albanians in these music videos. So a couple of high-level figures who've been involved in the cocaine trade in the UK include a man by the name of Klojan Kopja, who was arrested for his leading role in supplying cocaine in the UK. And another individual who's featured in open source reporting is a man by the name of Fatjan Doughty. Now, he himself was not actually convicted of a crime. Instead, he was given an exclusion notice by the Home Office, who alleged that he played a significant role in serious organised crime across multiple criminal enterprises. So rather than being convicted of a crime and sent to jail, instead he had his permanent residency revoked, which prevents him from residing in the UK. Now, Doughty's network, as I mentioned, was involved in a number of different criminal activities, but particularly was involved in the importation and the trafficking of cocaine. Now, he will crop up again in the next episode when we cover corruption in Albania. Now, the truth is, despite these record seizures that have been recorded across Europe in recent years, they are most likely not making a dent in the cocaine trade itself. Seizures are believed to represent only around about 10% of all the cocaine that's trafficked on the continent. And the best way to gauge the level of the cocaine market is to track the price and the purity of the product. So if the price is going up, then that would suggest a restriction on supply, and therefore suggest that seizures and interdictions are having an effect. And if the purity goes down, again, that means that criminals are generally cutting their cocaine with other products in order to make a little go a long way. Again, purity is going up, which suggests that supply remains unchecked. So what we've got is a situation with incredibly high demand from consumers across Europe, incredibly high supply from producers in South America, and an end-to-end business model established by Albanian criminals, which has undercut competition by lowering prices and increasing the purity of their product. So while Albanian groups have their reputation for violence, and it is a well-earned reputation that dates back to the 1990s, the state of the market itself means that there's little need for conflict between these groups, as the market is so large that there is plenty of room for everyone to operate. So now that Albanians have established themselves as key players in Europe's most profitable drug, in Europe's most used drug, and in human trafficking, how do these groups maintain their power? Well, in the next episode, we are going to take a look at some of the tactics that they employ and the general defining characteristics associated with the behaviour of members of Albanian organised crime groups. So we'll be taking a look at how they launder their money. We'll be taking a look at their reputation for violence and how they use violence to enforce and control their markets. How they sow and exploit corruption in countries across Europe, but particularly Albania. How they enjoy the proceeds of their crime, and how they attempt to avoid law enforcement.